Let's get ready to rumble. We are on page Yud Amud Aleph, or if you're following in the art scroll, we are on 10A2, I believe. Okay? Tanu Rabbanan. Our rabbis taught. Can you see it? Tanu Rabbanan?
We didn't. I don't know. If we
Right by the
left
two
off
dots.
Right before. Did we cover with the three kavs? Or
Yeah.
that was pertaining to.
Yeah, we covered that. Yeah.
Okay.
See the two dots right there? Tanu Rabbanan, right in the middle?
Yeah.
All right, Eretz Mitzrayim?
Oh, in the middle? Okay, cool. Got
There you go. Tanu
Thank
Rabbanan.
you.
Sorry, I should have said Tafresh. Tanu Rabbanan. It's the abbreviation. How is anyone supposed to know? Okay. Our rabbis taught. Eretz Mitzrayim. Havya daled meot parsa al daled meot parsa. The land of Egypt is 400 parsa. Parsa is a measurement that maybe is not as in such a prevalent usage anymore as it used to be. But a parsa is 4 mil. A mil is shorter than a mile. So together, for a parsa, right? Parsa is 4 mil, is roughly, I'm not looking exactly how much it is, but let's say around 2.5 miles. Let's just round it off, okay? So 400 parsa, so 400 times 2.5 miles, okay, times, or by 400 times 2.5 miles. That's roughly the square area of Mitzrayim. So just for, like they say, J for J, I went on Google, I wanted to see how big is Egypt.
1,000 miles. Here to Florida, times 2.
Egypt is 393,000 square miles.
Nowhere near this number that you just said.
Nowhere near this number that we just said. But you're talking about modern day Egypt.
Right.
And they're talking about the time of Egypt and the time of the...
Right. It could be inclusive of all the other lands around.
It could be inclusive of other lands around it. I did the math online. I think the number came out. So it's 400 times 2.5 if someone wants to try it. So it's approximately 1,000. And 1,000 times, I did 2.3, so it was 920. So if let's say it's 1,000, 1,000 times 1,000 gives you a square footage of, sorry?
Million?
Of 1,000,000, right? It's 1,000 times 1,000. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right. So the first number I came up with was 800 because I was doing 2.3, which is the lowest opinion. That comes out to 846,000.
Huge.
Right. So that is far less than the 393 that you're talking about now. But it also is important to understand that when you talk about ancient Egypt was not only was it a different land, it was a completely different culture. So ancient Egyptians were not Arabs. Today, Egyptians are Arabs.
Wow.
Ancient Egyptians were a whole different culture. They weren't the sons of Ishmael. They were the sons of Kush. Right? If you look at the Torah in Genesis, where does Mitzrayim come from? He's one of the descendants of Kush through Noach. So it's not the same lineage at all. It's not the same people. It's not the same religion. Remember, ancient Egypt was hieroglyphics. It was a pagan culture, whereas Ishmael and the evolution of the Arabs was not that. Okay? So, let's carry on. So, ancient Egypt, says the Gemara, was 400 parsa by 400 parsa. V'hu echad mishishim b'kush. And that number is only 1/60th of Kush. Kush is loosely translated as Africa. Okay? V'kush, but again, remember, Egypt is not in Africa. Correct?
It is
It's North Africa.
Middle East.
So it's
Asia.
kind of Middle East, Asia, right? There's a lot of crossover in these areas, right? Now, again, remember, Kush is not a land, it's a person. It's a person and his descendants. Okay? So effectively what you're talking about is the nation and how far that nation turned into a nation state, how far that nation state spread. So Kush, which again is referenced already, we have it referenced as a person in the Torah. It's referenced as a country where, excellent, Megillah. מהודו ועד Kush. Sheva ve'esrim u'mea medina. So Kush, in the time of this description of the Gemara, was 60 times the size of Egypt. V'Kush echad mishishim ba'olam. It's 1/60th of the area of the land mass. I don't know if it's the land mass or the total mass, but I would imagine it's the land mass of the world. Ve'olam, and the world, of the full mass. Because remember, Africa is a continent. There's not 60 times the African continent in the world. But if you include the waters, now the numbers start to make a lot more sense. Okay? Now, the Gemara continues. The Kush, sorry, and that's 1/60th of the world. Ve'olam, and the world, echad mishishim began, is 1/60th of Gan Eden. V'gan echad mishishim le'eden. Remember, Gan Eden means a garden of Eden, which we always use together. But Garden of Eden means that there was a garden, and the garden was in Eden. So Eden is 60 times the size of Gan Eden. So each one of these is a 60th of that which comes before it.
So who lives in Eden?
Sorry?
Who lives in Eden if they don't live in Gan Eden? Who lives in the rest of it?
Good question. The Gemara is not talking about yet the inhabitants. Okay? The Eden, echad mishishim legehinam, is 1/60th of Gehinam. So Gehinam is enormous compared to Gan Eden, which makes a lot of sense if you think about the amount of people who need to live in Gan Eden versus the amount of people who need to live in Gehinam. Continues the Gemara and says, and there's another opinion that actually goes a little bit of a different side. Nimtza kol ha'olam kulo. Turns out that the whole world, kikisui kidera legehinam, is only like the top of a pot cover for Gehinam. Okay, Gehinam is enormous. This is like a thin piece of metal as compared to Gehinam. So Gehinam's space occupies far more than the entire world, including Gan and including Eden.
It's very easy to get thrown there.
Very easy to get thrown. Hold on, we're gonna get there in just a second because it's gonna get worse before it gets better. Yesh omrim, and there are those that say Gehinam en la shiur. Gehinam is limitless. There's no measuring Gehinam. Yesh omrim, but then the Gemara continues and says there's some that say Eden en la shiur. Eden has no shiur. So
how could that be if Gehinam is 1/60th? If Eden is 1/60th of Gehinam, how could Eden be limitless?
So this V'yesh Omrim is changing that.
Okay.
So this opinion says no, Eden is not a 60th of Gehinam, but rather it is endless shiur. It doesn't have a shiur. Now I don't know.
No measure like maybe of time.
Sorry.
Endless because you have to do it time.
So I have one issue with that.
Why are they talking like the previous measurement?
When we start, the measurements we're talking about are not time measurements; they're spatial measurements. So it would be weird to switch midstream to discussing another measurement. The Gemara continues and says, "Yeshu en la eden en la shiur." Okay, so what exactly is it that we're trying to communicate here? So there's just one or two things I'd like to kind of point out, which I think are important to understand. This idea of 1/60th is a number that we use very, very often. Sorry?
Kazayat.
It's used.
On
It's used in the laws of kosher. Correct. Now, it's not necessarily specifically with the kizayit, but it's in the laws of kosher. So, in other words, if you have 1/60th milk in meat, batel. Anytime you're trying to say that this object is no longer here, we have this idea called batel b'shishim, is annulled or nullified in 60. Why do we choose the number 60? That's 40.
Oh.
At the number 60, the simple understanding goes that the number 60, you can no longer, that's the amount that at that stage you can no longer taste the impact of a food on another food. So this idea of 1/60th represents a stage at which there's no taste anymore of that thing. 1/60th is a taste. Less than that, okay?
It's a benchmark.
159th is
drowned
a
out.
taste.
Sorry?
159th is a taste, and 1/60th is not.
No,
Correct. Yeah, at that stage, once you hit your 1 in 60, yeah, then you're it's a almost a measurement of insignificance. Okay? But it's there. So if you're more than that, if you're 1.5 in 60, there's a taste. Now, obviously, all of us can understand that there's certain flavors that are very mild. So a measurement of something for a very sharp tasting food, if you're trying to discern taste, is not going to be 1/60th. And indeed, that's what the halakha tells us, that a davar charif, something that's very sharp, will have a much higher rate of distribution required in the mixture in order to be able to to dissipate. Okay? That's why it's called a davar charif. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's not for nothing that we use this number all the time. The Gemara says that when a person dreams, their dreams are 1/60th of prophecy. When a person sleeps, the Gemara says, it's 1/60th of death. So each time we're communicating, that number communicates the faintest taste of. All right? So I think if a person was to try and address it, I'd imagine that the first bits of the Gemara are describing ways of figuring out or feeling the scope of the size of Kush or Egypt or wherever. And I think if you were to look into it, you'd figure out why the Gemara thought it was important for us to know the specific measurements of only those countries. Right? Why Egypt and Kush? How come you didn't tell me about everything else?
Those were relevant locations?
There are other relevant ones too. Rome, Greece,
well, it's
Persia.
Also, it was all the known world at the time, too.
Sorry?
It was the only known world.
All of those
Asia.
ones I just mentioned were known at the time.
Right.
Rome, Greece,
Right.
Persia. Those are the world powers.
Right.
Even more than Kush.
Israel.
Right? Israel. So, at least in its importance, if not in its military might. Right. But the point is that the Gemara is trying to communicate, I think, that each one of these, as compared to the other, was insignificant. Okay? So let's carry on. And I think that, again, a further study of this would yield why we chose to talk about Mitzrayim and Kush as opposed to other places. I have my own theory, but that's not for now. Okay? Let's carry on. So when you get all the way to Gehinnom and to Gan Eden, then you start to realize actually what the Gemara, why we're talking about those places. Now we got to this because we were just talking about the rain stemming or coming through to the world through Gan Eden. That's what we spoke about last week. So we talked about the amount and the size. So the Gemara then just chose to use this opportunity to teach you this lesson. Now remember, when we ended off last week, we talked about the amount of drainage of a water of a bet kur feeds shlosha kavim, 3 tarkav, right, of land that requires that amount of seeds, and the measurement there was 1/60th. So you can understand the connection between that Gemara, which talks about the rain coming through that process, and now a discussion about size-related 1/60ths. Okay, so the Gemara gets down to this idea of Gan Eden, that Gan is the 60th of the Kush is the 60th of Gan. Gan is the 60th of Eden, or according to the other opinion, Eden is limitless, and Eden, and all of that is a 60th of Gehinnom. I think the interpretation, at least in far of why they thought that was important for us, is for us to recognize a person a lot of times thinks that, they'll get away with stuff in this world, and, Gehinnom, well, how bad is it going to be? I'll enjoy myself here, all right, I'll pay the price. I'll deal with it then. It'll be what it will be. The Gemara's expressions and teachings about Gehinnom were designed to be a deterrent that the person should recognize the vast capabilities and the vast space that Gehinnom or the punishment occupied. Okay, and vice versa as well. The concept of Eden being limitless is to encourage a person to do the mitzvot because the reward and the possibility for X, it's not 5X or 10X, it's not 50X or 100X. It's Eden is limitless. En la shiur. Tana Rabbanan. Sorry. Amar Boshia. Raboshia taught. My dichtiv. What does it mean when it says Shachanta al mayim rabim? Yeah, the one that lives or the one that rests on the great waters. Rabat otzarot, who has tremendous amount or giant-sized warehouses. Mi garam leBavel sheyehu otzrotea me'eot? Who caused Rabat otzarot? There should be full storehouses and warehouses. Havi omer mepnei sheshochenet al mayim rabim, because it dwells and it sits on a great amount of waters. You see, because when it mentions shochenet al mayim rabim, Rabat otzarot, that which dwells on great waters, has much in the storehouses and the warehouses. So what's it communicating? Amarav, Rav communicated, Atira Bavel. Bavel is very rich, right? Remember we talked about certain letters in Aramaic, they're interchangeable. Letter Taf and the letter Shin are interchangeable. So Atira and Ashira are the same. Ashira Bavel, Atira Bavel. Bavel is wealthy, is rich. The Hasda Belo Mitra. Because a person is capable of bringing in food and taking in grain and produce and whatever without having it rain. So since it doesn't need that like Eretz Israel, so therefore you're living in an agricultural paradise. Where does Bavel live right now? Bavel is on the Euphrates. The Bavel or Babylon, ancient Babylon, was in the Fertile Crescent. So that area was a perpetually fertile landmass. Amar Abaye. Abaye taught, Naktinan, we learned, right? Tov'ani velo yuvshani. That part of the reason why it is the way it is with regards to needing rain or not needing rain is because since it's tov'ani, comes from the word tavua, like betomot tiba. Tiba means to drown. Babel is drowning in the moisture of the lowland, of the swamps, of the rivers that empty out there. And therefore, velo yuvshani, it never dries out. And that's the nature of Bavel. Just important to recognize that while the whole world would look at that as a positive thing, Judaism sees that as a negative thing. You see, when the Jewish people got to Eretz Israel is a land that has no irrigation capabilities.
Depend on that shit.
It depends completely on the rain. And therefore, it taught the people to be able to look up. If you remember, we talked about the progression of the Jews from the Nile River to the desert with an ever-present well of Miriam, and then going all the way into Eretz Israel, where all the things disappear and they're relying on a daily basis. They have to look up and ask Hashem for rain. That illustrates a very strong and deep connection between God and the Jewish people. Whereas Bavel was exactly the opposite. When did that start?
What start?
This idea that Bavel should be tova'ani velo yuvshani, should be swampy, should be filled with water all the time and not need to look up as opposed to, and not be dry. When did that start?
After Noah.
When's the first time? Excellent! Ketone Pasim. Where do we find that? Exactly in Parshat Noach. In Parshat Noach, the people move and they make Migdal Bavel. What's the purpose of the Tower of Babylon?
To get to God.
To rise up and defeat God. So in the place where humanity first waged war against God, God says, you want to be on your own? No problem. Nothing to do with you. And Bavel became the place that never needed rain, that never needed God, but also that didn't have the opportunity of interaction with God. It was God saying, I don't want you, I don't want your prayers, I don't want to connect with you. Okay? Clear?
But then why leave them off on a good note as opposed to
What do you mean?
Meaning, you could say, God could have said,
To
you're
hell
on
with
your
you.
own,
Yeah.
to hell with you, you're in the desert, versus
Rather,
here's
rather it's
fertile
like
land
here's,
that
yep.
you could prosper.
It's a great question. We have another experience, another example of that, and that is the snake. The snake in the story of Gan Eden. God says, everything that you eat will taste like dust. And the Chachamim say that's a big beracha, because that means he can eat anything. The snake never goes hungry. Now, for a human being, you're like, oh my gosh, I have no taste. Wow, I have corona. It's terrible. But if you're living in the wild, and you can't go to a reserve cut, you can't order food on Uber Eats, right? You need to forage for food. An animal that can eat anything has the highest chances for survival. It's funny. I always like talking about how you see Torah and science operate in tandem. And it's so cool when you get to see that. So we know from the very beginning, right, from the time of way back when, God says that the snake is going to eat dust. It's going to eat, there's not, won't taste the food. And today that we actually can test that, we know that a snake has no taste buds. There's no way they possibly could have known that back then. And in the Torah it says that a snake has no ability to taste. Isn't that wild?
That is wild.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
So they knew it, they didn't know.
They knew from the Torah.
So the Torah said.
Sorry?
How do you know that a snake has no taste buds?
Now they have the methodology to be able to take the. You can see with a microscope. You can see the taste receptors on a person's tongue. They take the tongue out of the snake. They can see whether it has the taste receptors. And wild.
They try.
Yeah. It says no
Yeah.
good.
You know what they do? They feed it Ashkenaz food. It's a part of it. They see it chooses the Ashkenaz food. They know. Sorry for that on the video. Okay, let's move right along. Let's continue now with the Mishnah. So we've had a very long hiatus into a great many different topics surrounding the blessings of rain, the understandings of the sky, the process of all of these things. But now we're going to come back home through the country roads to West Virginia and discover a world of halacha and of Mishnah back to where we were before. So up until this point, if you remember, last time we talked about in the Mishnah talked about the times when we start saying Givurot Geshamim, 10 Talim Matar, Devracha. When do we mention Givurot Geshamim? So when the last Mishnah, we talked about when you end saying 10 Talim Matar, you start saying what's it called? The prayer for rain. So now we're going to start talking about when do you start saying that tefillah? Rabban Gamliel says, the Mishnah continues, Begimel Mar Cheshvan, on the third day of Mar Cheshvan, Shoalin et HaGeshamim, is when a person begins to ask for rain. Now, if you remember, we had a few different opinions of those dates, the 17 days, the 21 days. Remember that? So the Mishnah is now going to bring the opinion of the Tanaim. On the third day of Mar Cheshvan, Shoalim et HaGeshamim, that's when we start asking for rain. Rabban Gamliel. So remember, this in the beginning we talked about Givurot Geshamim, the mentioning of the power of rain. Here we're talking about the actual tefillah for the rains. Okay, says the Gemara. Rabban Gamliel says B'shiv'abo. When do we do it? No, not the third, like the Tanakama, like the first part of the Mishnah says. No, he disagrees. We start doing it on the seventh day of Mar Cheshvan. Tet Vav Yom Ahar Hag, 15 days after we finish Shemini Aseret. So, as an example, if you take the holiday of Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot has 7 days, then you have Shemini Atzeret, starts on the 14th. 14 days plus 8 days gets you to 22 days. So from Shemini Atzeret, if you go the 22nd and you count 15 more days, so you count the rest of the days in the month of Tishrei, that's 8 more days, and then 7 days into the new month, that's 15 days after, that day is when we start asking for rain to fall. Not mentioning that God could make it rain, how powerful Hashem is, that He knows how to make it rain, etc., etc. Rather, we're asking God, please make it rain right now. Okay? When do we do that? Says Rabban Gamliel. No, not the third day, seventh day. That gives you 15 days from Shemini Atzeret. Why? What's the reason? Kidei shiagia Aharon b'Israel lenahar Pirat. So that the last Jew, the last person that went to Eretz Israel, that went up to the Beit HaMikdash, they'd return home, and that journey home from the Beit HaMikdash until the Nahar Pirat, the Euphrates River, which was in the area of Babel, they shouldn't get rained on. Now remember, it's not like now when you're getting rained on when you're driving in your car and you put on the windshield wipers. They're traveling on dirt roads. So as an example, when it rained then when they were traveling, you could properly get stuck. The horses, the animals couldn't move. In bad cases, when it rained in the wrong places, your person could get swept away by flash flooding in various places. So Rabban Gamliel says the guy made his journey. Why is he coming to Israel? How come they're here? Sorry? For the holiday, for Shalosh Regalim. Not because they want to keep one day. Back then, they had one day anyway. Right. Why are they going to Israel? They were going to Israel because there's a pasuk. The pasuk says, Shalosh Pa'im V'Shana, Yera'eh Kol Zechurecha. 3 times a year, all the males have to attend. They have to appear to the place that God commanded. They all have to go to the Beit HaMikdash. So we started asking for rain the day after the guy got home. 15 days later.
Where
Okay?
does it say when the only way the person on the road could stop rain? Where is that if a person's traveling, they have the power to ask Hashem not to rain, and then we hold by that?
What you're referring to is a Gemara in Yoma, where the Gemara says that the prayer of the Kohen Gadol was the Kohen Gadol would ask Hashem, say, please make it rain in its time. And don't listen to the traveler who's traveling and saying, Hashem, please don't make it rain. Who's putting himself above all of the people. But you see from that Gemara that the traveler, if not for the Kohen Gadol praying on Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKodashim, his prayer might be accepted because he's really sincerely, genuinely is praying from the bottom of his heart because you don't want to get stuck.
Right.
That's how powerful the prayer, even of a single individual, is that it can inconvenience everybody else. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, says if you want to follow in the English, you can turn the page now. Okay, says the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar taught. Halacha ki Rabban Gamliel. So we have 2 opinions in the Mishnah. When do we start reading it? We start reading it on the 3rd of Mar Heshvan. Says Rabban Gamliel, no, we start reading on the 7th day of Mar Heshvan. What's the difference? One of them gives you 11 days for travel. One of them gives you 15 days for travel. We have to figure out why Mr. 11, Tanakama, you guys familiar with Tanakama? Yeah. Tanakama means first Tana, first position. So in the Mishnah, we just had a no-name, white label Mishnah, okay? It just says, when do you do it? 3rd of Mar Heshvan. Who's that? We don't have a name for who this is. So that's called Tana Kama, the first Tana.
Why do they do that?
Sorry?
Why do they not name the person?
Because oftentimes, that would be Rabbi Meir.
Right.
Rabbi Meir was the Stam Mishnah, Rabbi Meir. If you have a general Mishnah, the Mishnah is generally Rabbi Meir, and since he was the one that was always talking, they just felt they didn't need to always say that this is who the compiler of most of the author of most of the actual Mishnayot is. Rabbi Yehuda compiled the Mishnayot. Rabbi Meir was the general, the backstop. If you don't know who it is, it's probably him. But a lot of times the Mishnah will ask, the Gemara will ask, who's this Mishnah going according to? And it will find other people that it could also have been. But in a general sense, it would be Rabbi Meir. But the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, Halacha ki Rabban Gamliel. The halacha follows Rabban Gamliel that we wait until the 7th. Tanya, we learned in a Braita. Hananya used to say, Ubagola ad shishim batikufa. So if you're familiar, we, and in Eretz Israel, we start saying Barech Aleinu on different days. In fact, a lot of time people get gassed.
4th or 5th.
Because in today's world, we'll see that in a second. In today's world, people from Israel are posting on social media, don't forget to say Baruch Aleinu today, not thinking that only they're saying Baruch Aleinu today. Okay? So, in Bagola says Hananya, in the diaspora, Ad Shishim Batikufa, you'd wait not until 15 days after, but you'd wait until 60 days into the Tikufa. Tikufa means a set time, so a season or whatever, but it's based on, actually, and this is always an interesting thing for people to figure out, why in the world would we give you a date like December 4th or December 5th? What does that have to do with the Jewish calendar?
Very silly.
It's very silly. The answer is, it's not silly at all, right? Because although the Jewish calendar is lunar based, right? Certain elements of the calendar are based on the seasons. The seasons are not lunar based. And just so you understand, that's why in Judaism we're forever adding months. Because summer doesn't move. The equinox, it doesn't move. And I don't mean the jib. Okay? That date, that time, it's a 365-day cycle. And it's divided fairly regularly into 4 neat categories. Okay? So since that's the case, global warming notwithstanding, since that's the case, right? When the shorter Jewish year, being 354 days, is now over, you start your new year, right? 12 days, 11 and a half is really the full number, but let's say 12 days behind the calendar of the sun, the English calendar, the Gregorian calendar. 2 years, you're now 24 days. 3 years, you're now 36 days. Okay? That's a full month. So you try and catch up. What's the problem? You only caught up how many days with an extra month? 30. So it's not actually once every 3 years, because that would not be enough. You see? So we have this complicated calendar system, which is actually a 19-year rotation.
The rabbi's only 19, you said this year.
Sorry?
So that's why you said the rabbi's only 19.
I was corrected on that. I was corrected on that. I'm not 19. I'm less than 19. Because if I've been on this God's good earth, I've been 43 sun years, right? Not yet 44 sun years. Then if you divide 7 into every 19 years, right? That's the amount of leap years. So I have 7 and 7, that's 38 years is 14, right? And the remainder from 38 to 44 is not another 5 rotations. So I incorrectly said I was almost 19 years old. I'm really about 15 and a half. About 15 and a half years, still can't order my first beer. Okay. Let's carry on before the police come and arrest me. All right. So, 60 days in, right? That date doesn't move. So it's the 4th or the 5th because there's a bit of variance in the solar calendar. It's 300. I think it's 364 and a change amount of days. So it depends on the 4th or the 5th.
Is this the only thing that we do according to the
English calendar,
Yeah.
as far as I know.
Chutz la'aretz?
I don't remember another thing where we say that the date of this is on an English date. I don't remember that.
Yeah, Rabbi, this only applies to outside of Israel?
Outside of Israel, correct. So,
What if I live like next door to Israel?
doesn't matter. In Israel, and that's why it makes the difference, ubagola. Okay? So in Israel, that's the halacha. Outside of Israel, we do not have the halacha. You wait until 60 days, and then you start asking for rain. Amar Rav Huna bar Chia Amar Shmuel. Rav Huna, the son of Chia, said in the name of Shmuel, halacha ki Hananya. The halacha follows according to Hananya. So, one more time. We have Rabbi Gamliel who says, according to Rabbi Elazar, that it says the halacha is according to Rabbi Gamliel. Then we have Hananya bring a braita that basically doesn't argue on that. He just adds and says, If you're in Chutz La'aretz, then you have to wait until 60 days after the season, which leads you to December 4th or 5th. Okay? So when he rules, when Rav Huna Bar Chia Amar Shmuel says the halacha is like Chananya, does that, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what Rebbe Elazar said. Only if you understand that Rebbe Elazar also said his halacha in the diaspora. But we don't have to say that. I'm just pointing out where the logic would actually take us. So the Gemara then continues. And what does the Gemara say on this last idea of Shmuel the halacha kechananya? V'habau minei Shmuel. They asked the question once of Shmuel, right? Where did Shmuel live? Everybody knows, right? Shmuel did not live in Eretz Israel. He lived in Bavel. Okay? Me'emat matkirinan v'ten tal matar. When does a person start saying v'ten tal matar? Amar lahu, he said, Mechimai litzive leve tavut rishba. Okay? When do we start saying v'ten tal matar? From the time ma'ai tzivi means wood. From the time that they bring up the wood, lebe tavot, right? Rishba into the like I don't even know how to describe a bet tavot, like a contemporary home, a small, like a garden like a sukkah, okay? Rishba of this person who would he was someone who was all the time hunting, okay? Now, why did they need that? Why is that the amount of time that we felt that we needed to wait in order to be able to do this? All right, was because at that stage it was evident that it's not possible anymore for them to go get the wood in a regular time. But when you're starting to put the stuff up already and you're putting away wood because you can't get to it anymore, that indicates that now we've hit the time of rain, and therefore we should be asking. Okay? So if that's the case, the Gemara is assuming that time is not equivalent to the time that you just said in the name of Shemuel. Answers the Gemara, well, who told you that they're not? Maybe both of those two things, the 60th day from the equinox and the time when they bring up the wood into the hunting space of Tavot, okay? At that stage, maybe those two things are at the same time. How do you know that it isn't? The Gemara then continues and says, okay, so we're accepting that. Ibailu, we have a question. Yom Shishim, the 60th day, Kilifne Shishim, okay? Or Kila'acha Shishim. The 60th day itself, is it inclusive or is it exclusive of the 60 days that you're referring to? Which way do you look at it? Lifnei shishim, so it's before and therefore you're not asking for rain, or it's la'achar and therefore you are asking for rain. Tashema, says the Gemara, let's come close. We're going to explain to you. Rav says, Yom Shishim kila'achar shishim. The day of the 60th day itself, kila'achar shishim, is equivalent to after the 60th. So on the 60th, what are you doing? You're already asking for rain because we consider it like it's after that period. Shmuel says, Yom Shishim kilifnei shishim. He held, no, the 60th day is part of that which came before it, and therefore you don't ask for the rain. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Nachman bar Yitzchak explained v'simanach. And how does a person supposed to remember this? Ila'i ba'umaya, tatai lo ba'umaya. The ones ila'i means those that are above. Ba'umaya, they need water. Tatai, those that are below, lo ba'umaya, they don't need water. Now, in what way does this help you remember? What's the siman that we're expressing over here? And the Gemara is explaining that since we're talking about Rav and Shemuel, so where each one of these lived was a way of communicating how you remembered the opinion of Rav. Rav is Ilai, he's on the above, he's like living in Eretz Israel. So Rav, he does not need because he's up at the. He needs because he's up at the top. They need, but Bavel, which is low, they get all the rainwater. Shmuel said, no, you don't need, and therefore you'll remember that according to Shmuel, Yom Shishim is Kilifnei Shishim. Now the Gemara continues and says, in the name of Rav Papa, Amar Rav Papa, Hilchata Yom Shishim Kila'achar Shishim. The halacha is that Yom Shishim, the 60th day, is Kila'achar Shishim. It says if it's after, and we do need, and we do pray specifically for rain on that day. So now, how does that shake out for us? How does that shake out this halacha of Rav Papa? Who's he following? If you look back, Kila'achar Shishim, he's following the opinion of Rav. And Rav Papa actually lived in Bavel. And he's telling you that we should follow the opinion of Rav. So why did he choose to go that way? What's the logic of Rav Papa's choice? Okay? The Gemara doesn't tell us. He's just telling us that that's how he ruled. Now, if we study Gemara in other places, we start to realize that that's obvious. We knew that, should have known that was going to happen, because most of the time the halacha actually follows Rav over Shemuel. Okay? So it could just be that Rav Papa is following that opinion as well. All right? Let's carry on. I think we're at 40 minutes. Should we carry on with the Mishnah? We'll continue next week. Sorry?
Rabbi, the bottom's interesting, number 42.
Yeah. Carry on.
It says that Rambam says that the Rambam rules that in lands close to Eretz Yisrael, such as Syria, Babylon, and Egypt, and in countries whose climate is similar to these, the 10 Talmud Matas should be recited as of the 60th day. So it like lumps them into that same category.
Yes, but that's not from the Gemara.
That's Rambam.
That's Rambam ruling. Now,
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, in the halacha in the morning, we've also covered this. Chamovadia actually rules and is posek halacha that you have countries like Argentina, other places where they get flash floods, rains all the time. That's dangerous.
Yep.
Chamovadia rules, and there are countries that they do not ever say Barech Aleinu. Could you believe that?
No.
So it makes a lot of sense.
So it makes
No, it's
sense.
not.
I'm going to pray for something that's going to kill me, right? So, I think what we're finding over here in Rambam and what Chamovadia is also paying attention to is that there's the halacha of the Gemara in terms of ascertaining what you should or shouldn't do, and that's divided on Gola versus Eretz Israel. But then there's also the reality of the fact that these countries need rain like Israel, so therefore we're going to adapt and say that they should be saying it earlier, or they should not be saying it until later, right? But I think that that's a post-halacha discussion as opposed to and a practical, if you will, amendment that more than coming out from what the Gemara says. Because in the Gemara we don't find that. The Gemara does not differentiate, it just says Gola. Rambam says, what do you mean? But I also need rain. You're going to tell me if I need rain not to pray for rain because I live across the border?
So they don't. So if you live in Syria,
I-
you don't do it on December 4th or 5th.
No, you do it earlier.
Yeah.
But that's not from the Gemara. That's what I'm trying to communicate.
Oh, I get. Okay, that's
Okay.
post.
That's post.
Gotcha.
That's
an amendment.
that we're doing editing in
We
post.
can do that.
In certain cases. Why? Because what we're saying is that's not the halacha, but I want to pray for it.
That makes sense.
Yeah? In the same way that in Argentina, you should be saying Barech Aleinu, but we're adapting it and saying, what do you mean? We're not going to pray for something that's going to kill us. So, can I ask you just a question? Let's say you do not hold like Rambam. And let's say you're going to read the Gemara and you're going to say, Gola Eretz Israel is a very clear line of demarcation. It's about diaspora versus Israel. It's not about regions and rainfall and whatever. How would you understand that? Why would there be a different prayer for Israel when I'm over here, and then if I'm over there, 3 feet to the left, past the line, now there's a different prayer?
Because we learned that Israel was the pipeline.
Excellent. So we've already learned the answer to this question. So if you want to learn the Gemara strict, like it says, and that's why I answered you the way I said, then you would understand it according in the context of the Gemara that we learned before. That through Eretz Israel, every other land is blessed. And that's why we're only going to ask for rain after Israel has asked for rain. Because before they've asked for rain and had their prayers answered, there's nothing really to talk about. Because they didn't get theirs. We're not going to get ours. That was one way, through the Beracha comes through Israel. And the second way that we expressed it was Tamtzit, which means that the leftover rain of Israel, if you remember, that was a Gemara that we saw much more recently, right? According to that, even more so, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to pray, even though you're 3 inches the other way. It doesn't make sense to pray at the same time as Israel, because that is part and parcel of the shefa of bracha for everywhere else. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Amen.
So Rabbi,
Yes.
in Babel, it's Hashem says, I don't want any